fall of the third dynasty of Ur marked the beginning of the end. After nearly 2 millennia of innovation, power, and legacy, the world's first great civilization began to unravel. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites sacked Ur, toppling the last major Sumerian dynasty. In the aftermath, the region splintered. City-states that once stood proud, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, struggled to maintain independence, falling one by one to rising outsiders, most notably the Amorites. But war was not the only threat. The land itself began to betray its people. Over-irrigation led to soil salinization, crippling agricultural output. Once fertile fields turned white and barren. The Tigris and Euphrates shifted, isolating cities that once thrived on their banks. Sumer's power, once forged in canals, kingship, and cuneiform, faded into fragments. By 1900 BCE, the Sumerians were no longer rulers but memories within their own temples and libraries. Yet even in decline, something remained. In the silence that followed the last Sumerian kings, their legacy whispered still in clay, in myth, and in stone. As the old Sumerian cities weakened, a new force emerged, the Amorite Semitic, speaking people from the west. They didn't arrive in a single invasion, but gradually, city by city, they became rulers, merchants, governors, and eventually kings. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Amorites controlled much of southern Mesopotamia, including the once great cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. They didn't destroy Sumerian culture. Instead, they absorbed it. Temples were maintained. Scribes continued their work. The Sumerian language still echoed in ritual and law. At the heart of this new order rose a small Amorite city, Babylon. By the time of King Hammurabi, around 1792 BCE, Babylon had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's law, codion of the most famous in history, borrowed heavily from earlier Sumerian legal traditions, including the Code of Ur-Nammu. Sumer as a political entity had vanished. But its architecture, administration, and theology remained deeply embedded in the Amorite Babylonian world. The conquerors ruled the land, but they walked in the footsteps of Sumer. By around 1700 BCE, the Sumerian language, once the living tongue of kings, farmers, and scribes, had vanished from daily speech. In homes and markets, people now spoke Akkadian, the Semitic language of the Amorites and Babylonians. But Sumerian did not disappear. Instead, it entered a new phase, sacred and scholarly. Like Latin in medieval Europe, Sumerian became the language of ritual, law, and learning. It was no longer spoken, but it was studied, recited, and revered. In temple schools called edubas, young scribes learned Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and poetry. They copied ancient myths, hymns, and royal decrees. These exercises weren't just academic, they preserved the voice of a lost civilization. Religious ceremonies still used Sumerian prayers. Legal texts retained Sumerian phrases. Even kings invoked Sumerian gods in their Akkadian inscriptions. The language of the past had become a symbol of continuity, wisdom, and divine order. Though no longer alive in conversation, Sumerian lived in the mind and hand of every educated Babylonian scribe. In this afterlife, the language endured for more than 1,000 years, not spoken, but eternal. Even as cities fell and languages faded, the Sumerians found immortality in clay. Across the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, many dating back more than 4,000 years. These fragile pieces of fired or sun-dried clay have outlasted kings, dynasties, and even the civilizations that wrote them. Among them are laws, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, hymns and prayers to gods long silent, mathematical tables and medical recipes, contracts and royal decrees, and most enduring of Alepic literature. The most famous of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, heroic tale of kingship, friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. First composed in Sumerian, it was reinterpreted, translated, and preserved for centuries by Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian scribes. These texts were not buried, they were copied by hand, line by line, generation after generation, in scribal schools and temple libraries. Through them, the thoughts, dreams, and fears of the Sumerians continued to speak. In clay, the mind of Sumer endured not only as record, but as story, soul, and legacy. Though the Sumerians were gone as a people, their civilization lived on, fully absorbed into the great powers that followed. The Babylonians and later the Assyrians did not reject the past, they built on it. In Babylonian temples, priests still chanted Sumerian hymns. Gods like Enlil, Inanna, Nana, and Utu remained central to the Mesopotamian pantheon. The very idea of divine kingship, a ruler chosen by the gods to bring order, was a Sumerian invention that Babylonian and Assyrian kings continued to claim. Temple economies, where sacred institutions controlled land, labor, and storage, mirrored Ur's ancient system. Codified law, refined by Hammurabi, had its roots in Sumerian legal codes like that of Ur-Nammu. Even the structure of time and science followed Sumerian precedent. The sexagesimal system base 60, math gave us 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Their methods of astronomy and calendar making were preserved, elaborated, and transmitted. To be Babylonian or Assyrian was to speak through the voice of Sumerto, worship their gods, count with their numbers, and rule with their ideals. The first civilization had not ended. It had simply become the standard. Though long forgotten by name, the Sumerians echo through Western civilization and law, religion, literature, and myth. Centuries after their cities fell, their stories lived on. The most striking is the flood narrative. In Sumerian texts like the Tale of Ziusudra, and later the Epic of Gilgamesh, a great flood wipes out humanity only for a chosen survivor to build a boat and preserve life. This story predates and parallels the biblical flood in Genesis, suggesting a shared regional memory passed across cultures. The Sumerians also imagined a complex cosmos, heaven above, the netherworld below, and divine forces shaping fate. These ideas would influence later Mesopotamian religions, and eventually ripple into the theological frameworks of the Hebrews, Persians, and Greeks. Their innovations were not only spiritual. The Sumerians gave the world the first written law, the first planned urban grid, and the first belief in a king whose authority was sacred and legal. Even in the West, when we speak of law, order, justice, cities, and divine narrative, we may still be echoing a civilization that lived, wrote, and imagined long before the Bible. In clay, the Sumerians created not just records but roots. For thousands of years, the Sumerians were silent. Their cities lay buried beneath the sands of southern Iraq. Their language was unreadable, their name forgotten. And then, in the 19th century, the world began to listen again. Archaeologists digging in the deserts of Mesopotamia uncovered the remains of Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and other long-lost cities. Beneath crumbling ziggurats and temple walls, they found tens of thousands of clay tablets, preserved in archives hidden beneath the earth. At first, no one could read them, but through decades of work, scholars began to decipher cuneiform. The first voices to emerge were not kings or warriors but scribes, recording crops, hymns, laws, and prayers. Slowly, piece by piece, the world's first civilization reappeared. We learned their names, their gods, their cities, and their stories. We heard Gilgamesh speak. We read Ur-Nammu's laws. We watched Inanna descend into the underworld. In dusty libraries and remote sites, Sumer had spoken again not in conquest, but in memory and discovery. A civilization buried for millennia had returned not as empire, but as echo. They no longer walk the earth. Their cities are ruins. Their language is silent. And yet, the Sumerians never truly vanished. They gave the world writing the power to preserve memory beyond the moment. They created cities, the model for how humans live together. They crafted the first legal codes, scientific observations, poetry, and philosophy of kingship. Their gods shaped mythologies that would echo into Babylon, Assyria, Canaan, and even Greece. Their systems of time minutes, hours, degrees still structure our days. Their voices, recorded in clay, continue to speak in libraries and museums around the world. Sumer may have fallen before Egypt reached its peak, long before Rome, before Jerusalem, before Athens. But what they built was not bound by stone. It was civilization itself. We may never know what they called themselves, but we remember what they gave us. They are whispers in the dusty days, but they are also the first voice of history. And that voice still echoes every time we read, rule, build, or remember.